Hi, I'm Emily Previty, the Pennsylvania Capital Star's audio reporter. My colleagues and I at the Capital Star and throughout the state's newsroom network had been covering budget negotiations since they started in earnest last spring. And then at some point during the summer, we realized that very few of us were actually still doing that because most states already had adopted a budget. So we got together with our colleagues at Michigan Advance and decided to team up on a project comparing notes and analyzing what's going on in these two states that are so similar in some very relevant ways, as you'll hear. We also wrote a story. It's a long one, and I hope you'll read that and enjoy our conversation in the meantime. Hi, I'm Emily Previty, audio reporter for the Pennsylvania Capital Star.
I'm Peter Hall, the senior reporter at the Pennsylvania Capital Star.
And I'm Ben Solis, senior reporter at Michigan Advance.
We are the only two states in our great nation that have not passed a budget for the 2025-26 fiscal year yet, after the deadline that both of our states have for doing that. And the consequences and the stakes are different in each state, as we'll get into, but everyone else has figured it out. Some states haven't finished negotiating, but there are some contingencies that they can rely on to get them through so there's not a government shutdown, or to mitigate the impact of not having a budget in place. Examples are North Carolina and Oregon. And there are some important similarities we should probably know between Michigan and Pennsylvania. Two of the only three state governments in the country that have divided legislatures, as our governor, Josh Shapiro, a Democrat, likes to remind us pretty much every time he's asked to explain why the budget has not been passed yet. There are some other similarities too. We are both considered Rust Belt states. We're considered swing states. We recently reconfigured our legislative districts. They're generally considered to be fairer than they were before, but that's part of why the legislatures are now divided. And that certainly doesn't help speed up budget negotiations. Pennsylvania has missed 13 of the past 20 budget deadlines, including one that lasted 9 months in 2015. Michigan shut down twice in 2007 and 2009. And with that, Ben, why don't you pick up from here?
Democrats currently control every lever of the executive branch and the state Senate. Democrats held control of both the executive and legislative branches in the previous two sessions before the Republicans retook the House in 2024. Prior to that Democratic legislative trifecta in 2022 and 23, the Republicans held control of the legislature for a good portion of several decades. The turnover in the House really saw the rise of now Michigan House Speaker Matt Hall of Richland Township here in Michigan, who has been a thorn in the Democrat side over the last 2 years, and particularly in the trifecta. During lame duck last year, he staged a walkout that pretty much stymied any forward progress for the Democrats. Now, fast forward, he's in control of the House and pulls the strings in many of the budget conversations that we're having now. And, very much at the beginning of the year, the two parties, the Senate and the House, did nothing but throw barbs at each other. Now that we're here, they can't seem to get their act together, coming to terms on things that are vital like roads, how to fund schools. Both have vastly different, drastically different methods of how to fund schools in our state. And at the same time, we have a governor who, much like your governor in Shapiro, has some presidential ambitions, and much of her legacy is reliant on us fixing our roads, which is another major sticking point in these budget negotiations.
Pete, how long have you been doing legislative coverage for, would you say, in Pennsylvania?
I've been with the Capital Star for about 3 years now, covered now 4 budget processes in that time. The first under former Governor Tom Wolf, and the most recent 3 under Governor Josh Shapiro. They're both Democrats. Big difference, like Michigan, is that Tom Wolf did not have a divided legislature. The Republicans controlled both chambers. With Shapiro's election, the Democrats won a narrow 1-vote majority in the House for the first time in 12 years or 6 terms. It is a somewhat different environment than we've seen in Pennsylvania for quite some time. This year, sticking points have been education again, a crisis in funding for mass transit agencies, in particular the largest one, SEPTA, which serves Philadelphia and the surrounding counties. And Medicaid is a big uncertainty this year with the reconciliation bill.
As we know, the impacts of cuts at the federal level are going to be felt increasingly over the next few years. And so we don't have to go down this rabbit hole of predicting exactly how and to what degree, but one can only imagine that it will make state budget negotiations thornier. What I thought was interesting in Michigan, a July 1st budget deadline doesn't signal the start of its fiscal year. That's not until October 1st. In Pennsylvania, because the state's fiscal year has started without a budget, money is not going out to agencies, other public agencies that are reliant on funding from the state, such as counties and schools. What is happening in Michigan, Ben, as far as the school districts and the impact on them?
The July 1 deadline was instituted after our government shutdowns in 2007 and 2009. It was a way of motivating the powers that be to try to get this budget process done early so we don't run into a deadline and, unfortunately, a government shutdown again. And that mirrored very much what the schools do in terms of their fiscal year budgeting, of trying to get their budgets done by June, get things rolling by July, and hopefully have the state legislature have money for them by the new fiscal year. Of course, this has caused quite a bit of uncertainty in this situation because we have schools that have already started the school year, have already started some of their fiscal year, and also have laid off quite a few key staff. Maybe not teachers, but reading coaches, professionals that work with kids. And so a lot of this has put the onus on them to try to figure out their budgets while the state is also fighting about their own. And aside from that, we're facing a massive road funding cliff. Our situation is that we have to fix our roads every single year because of ice wedging, various different climatic causes that really mess up our transportation in our state. We previously bonded out a lot of our road projects during the Whitmer years, our current governor. There was no legislative solution to be found in trying to pay for roads. We just couldn't come together on how we were going to do that. There was no appetite for a tax increase. There was no appetites for cuts to roads. So Whitmer kind of took the ball and said, we're just going to do it my way, and we're going to bond out all these projects. Now all that money is pretty much at the end. Those projects are all wrapping up that were previously funded by bonds. And Whitmer ran on a promise to fix our damn roads. That was her campaign slogan. And so she can't walk away from this without a solid road funding plan. So, there's a bunch of different financial implications that are going on here, aside from the political ones. But for right now, since we do not have a budget in place, schools are really the ones bearing the brunt of all of this.
In Pennsylvania, we're all paying our taxes still. The money's coming in, it's just not going out. And so schools, at a certain point, if they don't have enough money on hand, if the budget impasse stretches on for long enough, they'll have to borrow. Same with counties, and taxpayers are then covering the interest on any loans that their local school district or county government's taking out, even though we paid our taxes on time the whole time. And then there's the cost of how this might look to banks, to potential lenders. You were just talking about Ben bonding out for transportation infrastructure. Governments borrow money all the time. So that's another longer-term, slower-acting cost. You mentioned this July 1st deadline often is regarded as a joke, and there aren't consequences. But even with the start of the fiscal year months off, I mean, the people who are analysts are reading the news, and when they see the instability or conflict that's having these consequences on budgeting, on financial planning, that's not good for the state's credit rating. And that can increase borrowing costs in the future, which is more expensive, again, for the taxpayers.
While it was not the top line concern for a shutdown and for this budget impasse, one of the main things they said was that if you continue to have protracted shutdowns, repeated protracted shutdowns in a row, that'll certainly affect that. And another point, too, is that we have revenue sharing that gets pumped out through the state budget. And that's, money for cities, townships, and villages that really rely on our state sharing revenues with them. Currently, they have no idea what their revenue picture is going to look like. They definitely want the plan that will give them more money. But even if they have to decide between the two, they would very much like to know if they're going to have that money on October 1.
Pete, you did a story about the school funding issue and the impact on schools. So it would be great if you could talk a little bit about that.
The reality in Pennsylvania is that the budget is late most years. There is a June 30th deadline, the end of the fiscal year, to pass a new budget. And like Ben said, it's not often honored. It's a constitutional deadline, but there's really no immediate consequence for missing that. And the impact of that is that when school districts, which are statutorily required to pass budgets by June 30th, put together their budgets, they often don't know how much they're going to be getting. And that is more so in the last couple of years because Pennsylvania had a very consequential lawsuit against the General Assembly and the governor by 6 school districts and a handful of parents, in which the method for funding school districts, public schools, through property taxes was found to be unconstitutional. And the solution to that is not to reinvent how we fund schools, but to put more money into the system to make up the difference for the poorer school districts. And when we say poorer, that's like 370 some out of 500 school districts. Those school districts are $4.5 billion in the hole compared to the top school districts, the top performing school districts in the state. And so the legislature in 2024 agreed to pay out or add to its annual education spend $500 million a year over 9 years. They did that last year, roughly $500 million. And that helped a lot of school districts that had been scraping by. This year, it seems to be in question whether the legislature is going to do that again, because it was really a gentleman's agreement that they would do that, but there was nothing to ensure that the future legislatures would follow through.
I also wanted to, in the context of the transit funding debate, talk a bit about some of the confusion surrounding some of these discussions related to Amtrak, which Pete covered. And I felt like, as a journalist who's also been doing this for a while, the way that went down wasn't super typical, in my view.
So we had a congressman from Philadelphia, Brendan Boyle, made an announcement that the budget impasse had the potential to affect Amtrak service on the line between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, which is heavily used. I think the 5th most used Amtrak line in the nation. And it is funded in part by the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, but SEPTA, which shares the lines, it actually leases the lines from Amtrak, puts about $71 million into the pot for Amtrak to maintain those lines. And Boyle came out and said that if the impasse persisted and SEPTA didn't get its funding, that could lead, or he said it would lead, to the suspension of the Keystone line between Philadelphia and Harrisburg. That certainly was something that, called for fact-checking, and I reached out to Amtrak and SEPTA and the governor's office, and the truth appeared to be somewhere in the middle, as it often is. Amtrak said the lack of that $71 million would affect its ability to maintain those lines, and it didn't say that it would affect the Keystone service, but the potential was there.
Right. It was a much slower acting potentiality than the way that message was originally rolled out. It certainly got our attention. I think the discussion was, if this is true, why wouldn't they have mentioned it before? Because it certainly seems like a strike in favor of coming up with the funding. It would add to the urgency.
There's an element of truth in that, but more so than whether or not what the eventual effect will be. It's a good example of the cascading impacts of this budget impasse.
Ben, I don't know, how has it looked in Michigan for you and your colleagues? Has there been any confusion?
There has been some cracks forming, some fissures within the Republican caucus, because there have been complaints from the Democrats that they have not been able to really communicate with their respective colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, because much of this is being kind of hoarded and controlled by Hall. We did see one major crack form between Ann Boleyn, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House, and Speaker Matt Hall just a few weeks ago. We got really close to the House passing their budget, and Boleyn released a very lengthy public statement, saying that we're as close as a week out from passing our budget. We're confident that this is going to happen. Within hours on the House floor, Matt Hall publicly contradicted that entire statement, said, she's optimistic. We very much have seen some of this where Matt Hall has definitely taken the lead and controls much of this process. And I got to imagine that there are some tense conversations that have gone on within his caucus trying to figure out when they can release public statements on what their budget work is done, and if they need to check that with Hall before they make statements and then have their House Speaker contradict them just hours later. And the Democrats and the Republicans, they've been throwing a lot of barbs at each other since the beginning of session. Interestingly enough, a lot of that had to do with a situation where in last year's lame duck, there were many bills that were passed through the House from the Senate that moved, but when it turned over and Hall and the Republicans took over, they did not deliver those bills to the governor. And that was a big spat, because those were key Democratic priorities from the last session that never got across the finish line because the House just decided that they weren't going to send them over. Fast forward to here now, a lot of what we're seeing is just a lot of sniping. And it's been hard for these two parties to find any kind of common ground on policy. It's been hard to find common ground on what they're going to do to fund the budget. And, you've got Whitmer in the middle, who certainly does want these parties to come to a balanced budget. And so she's been kind of playing referee to these two parties, and it's been very difficult. There's been a lot of talk from the House Speaker that the Democratic governor is on his side in all these communications. Whitmer has since walked all of that back and said that's just political posturing. But Whitmer did do an interview before this budget cycle began that said that her and Matt Hall were the only ones with the guts and the brains to put forward a roads plan, which was a pretty direct swipe at her Democratic colleague in the Senate. In a recent press conference with Speaker Matt Hall, he was asked by several reporters, including me, what are you willing to give up? And his answer was nothing burger. It was, we'll see what we can do. It's really just deeply political. It's not even a matter of whether they agree on them, because they agree that roads need to be funded. They agree that schools need to be funded in some fashion, and whether that rolls up all of these categoricals for school meals into per pupil funding or how that works. The base agreements are there. It's just about who's going to win enough political points. It has completely stalled these talks. Meanwhile, we have the implications that we talked about earlier with schools, the credit rating, not funding the roads in this period of time.
Right, and with the roads, obviously, you then have the costs of stuff increasing as time goes on, the longer you wait to do a project. Pete, you've watched 4+ budgets. How would you say this year's political dynamics, one, compared to Michigan, but then also if it's a continuation of more of the same, are there some key differences that are sticking out to you?
I mean, between Pennsylvania and Michigan, from what Ben described, it sounds like our leaders in the Senate and the House have been a bit less personal in their attacks and positions. And honestly, the Senate seems to be really focused on the people rather than the lawmakers, which you might say is a good thing, but we had one Republican senator referring to the people of Philadelphia and their chauffeured rides to work in his criticism of the transit agency. The House Democrats have, it seems, really been focused on their goals and have, as far as I have seen, avoided any sort of personal attacks. We have Joanna McClinton, the Speaker of the House, is a Philadelphia resident, and her background is that she was a public defender in Philadelphia. She's very connected in her neighborhoods and has, for the first time, I think, since she was elected, done a number of one-on-one interviews about the budget. So really getting out the Democratic caucus's message there.
I also wanted to, in the context of the transit funding debate, talk a bit about some of the confusion when the transit bill passed in the Senate. I mean, SEPTA officials gave a press conference opposing it in the afternoon. Then, hours later, they send an email backtracking, saying they need more time to properly assess the plan. Meanwhile, the Senate floor debate's going on late into the evening. It's not even clear who's read the thing because it's 37 pages long. It's complicated. And at one point, you had the Senate Majority Leader Joe Pittman from Indiana County reading the lyrics of what ended up being John Mellencamp's Small Town into the record. I didn't totally realize what was happening at first because I'm reading this bill trying to figure out what it meant. And then we realized that was, in fact, what was happening.
I was born in a small town. I live in a small town.
That was a moment. It was a thing that happened during that floor debate.
One of many musical interludes we've seen in recent years in the General Assembly.
What were some others?
The one that comes to mind was in debate in the House over a resolution to honor Taylor Swift, something like declaring the Taylor Swift era in Pennsylvania. She, of course, is from Pennsylvania, Berks County.
She writes a lot of breakup songs, and let's not forget that she broke up with Pennsylvania by moving out. She crossed the border, she turned around and she looked at us and she said, "We will never, ever, ever getting back together."
Fun fact about that lawmaker, Russ Diamond, is that he claims to have actually had a role in Taylor Swift's very early career.
I produced compact discs for her.
He owned a recording studio. I'm not sure if he still did.
Are those Taylor's versions or are those the prohibited versions that we can't listen to?
I don't know who owns those now. It might be Russ. Who knows? Maybe that's his retirement plan.
I guess that's a good place to leave it on a lighter note during a budget process that's becoming or has become frustrating in both of our states. So thanks so much for listening. Ben and Pete, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Emily. It's been fun.
I'm Emily Previty. Thanks for listening.